Hello, and welcome to the New Gravity Housing Conference session, Scaling Up, Pursuing PHIUS and Net Zero in Different Housing Types. Before we get started, I'd like to remind our attendees that everyone is muted with your video off. Please make sure to utilize the Q&A feature in Zoom throughout this session to share your questions with our presenters. We'll be monitoring the Q&A throughout the session, and we'll also have a facilitated Q&A at the end. Please use the chat feature in Zoom for any side and general discussion. We'd also like to thank our sponsors for their generous support of this year's conference. Please make sure to check them out in our virtual expo hall. Here's a brief message from our sponsor, Intis, before we get started with this session. Thank you again to Intis and all of our New Gravity sponsors for making this conference possible. Now let's get into the session. Our speakers for this session are Lindsey Elton, President of EcoAchievers, Scott Farbman, Building Performance Analyst at Database Plus, Matthew McGrane, Studio Director at Farr Associates, and Kelly Moynihan, Associate Principal at Farr Associates. Here are the learning objectives for this session. And as a quick reminder, the New Gravity Housing Conference is approved for PHIUS, PHI, AIA, and GBCI credit. Thank you all for joining us, and don't forget to use the Q&A feature throughout the session to ask our presenters questions. Now, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers to get started.
I am Scott Farbman with Database Plus, and I will be your moderator today. As you saw on the introduction slide, you will be hearing from three subject matter experts: architect and associate principal at Farr Associates, Matthew McGrane; CPHC and associate principal at Farr Associates, Kelly Moynihan; and PHIUS Rater Verifier and president at EcoAchievers, Lindsey Elton. At a high level today, we will be discussing lessons learned on three different housing project scales and their pursuit of PHIUS Plus and Net Zero certifications. Matt, Kelly, and Lindsey will be giving their unique discipline perspective on each of these projects in hopes of educating all of you and progressing the industry knowledge base on these programs. During the presentation, please feel free to submit your questions over the Zoom platform, and we will be addressing them during the Q&A portion. With that, Matt, please take us into our first project.
All right. Thank you, Scott. As I said, my name is Matt McGrane, and I am an associate principal at Farr Associates. At Farr, our bread and butter is really kind of pushing the boundaries of sustainable design, and we do that both at a building scale and at an urban scale. This includes the first LEED Platinum in the Midwest, which is the Center for Green Technology, the first net zero projects in Chicago, and then most recently the region's first and largest living building challenge PEDAL certified project. So our office has always had, have always been strong proponents of PHIUS design principles. And we've been lucky enough in the last 3 or 4 years to have worked on 3 different PHIUS net zero projects at different scales. Each one of those helped inform the next one, and while the learning curve has come down a little bit from project to project, each project also represents its own unique challenges as we worked to scale up. So we'll be talking about 3 projects today. The first is Granite City Green, a public housing duplex in Granite City, Illinois. and Farr Associates' first certified Passive House project. The second is the Ames residence, which was recently completed, and that's a single-family renovation in Chicago. And then lastly, we'll talk about Broadway Lofts, which is a multi-family affordable housing project in Gary, Indiana, which will start construction in August. All right, so to start, Farr prides ourselves on our integrated design process, which brings design team and stakeholders to the table early and foregrounds design decision-making based on upfront research and collaboration. So we really try to make sure that all voices are heard early in the process, and that includes our engineers, consultants, clients, stakeholders, and in some of these cases, residents. Similarly, our office strives to make all of our projects net zero ready. And what that means is all of the design decisions that are the purview of the design team, that we try to make the best decisions possible early on in ways that minimize the overall energy demand to its absolute lowest before we start to consider renewables. So, if our projects can't afford to do PV right away, we want our base building to be ready at the most efficient that it can be before we, hopefully we can get those PVs in the future. And so this approach goes hand in hand with PHIUS design principles of highly insulated, airtight building envelopes combined with efficient and minimally sized mechanical systems. And so I will quickly pass it to Lindsey, who will talk a little bit more about PHIUS concepts before we get into the projects. So Lindsey.
Great, thanks, Matt. And hi, everyone. My name is Lindsey Elton with Eco Achievers. I'm president and partner there, and we've been really fortunate to be a part of all three of these projects. And as we get started, I just wanted to give everyone a sense of where PHIUS stands in the continuum of green building certifications, and to kind of set a foundation that there's a variety of different certifications, and there's kind of pocket categories of where they fall, and there's also an evolution. So as we see, PHIUS is on the far right, and it's a combination of Energy Star, Zero Energy Ready, and Indoor Air Plus. Unlike LEED and Enterprise Green, which Granite City was also a participant in, those programs take a more broad view of sustainability, where PHIUS is really intense on the energy, durability, and indoor air quality. So here's a visual representation. I also wanted to just let folks know that when you're pursuing these projects, you are getting certified in all four certifications. So Energy Star is the basis, and you've got mandatory checklists and compliance criterias, inspections, performance targets. Then you hit Zero Energy Ready homes, and that's a higher target. You bring in domestic hot water distribution efficiency, and then we also are adding in the Indoor Air Plus. So we're getting, we're really tightening up the envelope, or tightening the envelope. We are making our systems as efficient as possible, and we want to make sure that that indoor air is as healthy as possible for the occupants.
Great, thank you. All right, so we'll jump into the projects here. So our first PHIUS project is Granite City Green. So the photo you can see on the lower right, this is a multi-phased public housing replacement project. So we've done 3 phases to date. The first phase took advantage of stimulus dollars to build about 40 units. This last phase, we are taking advantage of ICECF funding, which we'll talk about in a minute. And the interesting thing about this project, since it's being built in phases, is that we can really test our performance from one phase to the other. So our first phase, we built enterprise green standards, which Lindsey just talked about. And then our prototype here is to PHIUS and net zero standards. So we can actually compare those one-to-one to a building that was just built, in the last 5 years. So with this project, our client partner actually came to us demanding a passive house, which was great. They knew that we were hungry to do one, and they were as committed as we were to making it happen. So that was great. So we had the mandate to do it, and then the client wanted us to take a building type from the previous phase of construction, in this case a 1,500 square foot 2-story duplex, and document the steps that were needed to take this from a very efficient building to a PHIUS building. So to make this possible, we took advantage of grant funding from the ICCF, which has prioritized funding the incremental improvements that help projects achieve PHIUS and/or net zero certification for both 501c3s and local government agencies. So this project was, kind of set up perfectly to take advantage of that grant. It allows up to $2 million per project, or up to 60% of project costs. So in our case, it helped to pay for upgrades to windows, insulation, photovoltaic panels, and then some of our kind of soft costs related to design and kind of quality control during construction. So part of taking advantage of the funding was designing an education program, both for the residents and for local builders. For residents, the families that were selected to live in the prototype were given information on how this building may be different from their previous homes, and really what they could do to help reduce overall energy demand. They were also able to take advantage of the utility cost savings of living in a passive house and net zero building through a reduction in their rents, which was really an incentive for folks to try to apply and be the residents that would test out the prototype. And for builders, we compiled a case study and also provided tours to showcase the strategies both during construction and now that it's built. And I'll pass it to Kelly, who will talk a little bit about what were the adjustments that we made to make the building on the upper right, which was the original building, into the building on the lower right, which is the PHIUS certified building. So Kelly, take it away.
Thanks, Matt. So I'm Kelly Moynihan, architect and CPHC at Farr Associates, and I've been very fortunate to be able to learn about PHIUS through practice, which is the best way. As Matt has highlighted, we've had a series of projects that we get to learn a little as we go. So starting with this one, it was great because we had a building design to work with, and it was a pretty simple kind of floor plan and geometry. The images you're looking at now, the upper image of the two homes you see there, the upper image was the original design and the lower image was the passive house design. And so, as Matt said, the client already told us that this is what they wanted to do, but we had to do a few tweaks to it to optimize it for PHIUS. And that started with some kind of site tweaks and reorientation of the building on the site to optimize it for solar and kind of have the windows placed in the right orientation for heat gain and things like that. So that was kind of the easy thing to do right off the bat. And so through those changes and the changes to the envelope and mechanical systems, we were able to cut the EUI in half, which made it possible to offset the energy use with rooftop photovoltaics more possible. Beyond that, because this was supposed to be a true side-by-side case study of the already built version of the duplex versus PHIUS, we needed to keep the same design look. Luckily, the original design wasn't too complex. Like I said, pretty simple geometry with few complicated assembly junctions, no real unnecessary corners, so the list of details to analyze was short. So it was a great starter PHIUS project for us in that respect. One of the things we did have to examine, because we did want to keep the same aesthetic, was we had to examine the deep overhangs and balcony and porches that were originally big thermal bridges. So we analyzed those through therm and kind of the typical channels in therm and WFI, and figured out we had to use thermally broken connection elements to puncture through that exterior continuous insulation and have that accounted for in our WFI model. Well, luckily, like I said, there was really very few of those to analyze. So this was our first PHIUS project, so the learning curve on the requirements and documentation was a challenge. It took us about 4 different iterations in WFI to finally meet all the targets for certification. And then beyond that, it took a lot of hand-holding with an inexperienced contractor that hadn't done any PHIUS projects before to talk through all the details and the requirements, such as a stringent air tightness target that they had never had to meet before. And I'll pass it to Lindsey now, and she can kind of get further into what that looked like after that was handed off.
Cool, thanks, Kelly. So when you're working with a PHIUS rater or verifier, depending on what type of project you have, it's really important to bring us in as early as possible. And that's what the Farr team did and the Granite City team did. So we got our own energy modeling done, which is different from the WFI modeling that Kelly had performed. And we verified at the beginning that we would be in compliance with the other certifications that are part of the program. And then we get ready for mid-construction. And during mid-construction, we're verifying a variety of different details, because the role of the rater is the boots on the ground. We are the connection in between design and certification. We make sure that what was designed is what was built, and that it's the builder who does it, you know, but we are affirming that it was done. So we're looking at framing details, insulation, both interior and exterior, air sealing details, which is huge with PHIUS because of the air tightness and the blower door infiltration threshold target. So to help teams, we also do mid-construction performance testing, which isn't required with PHIUS, but it really helps teams understand and gauge the efficacy of their work during mid-construction and to that point. And we can also deal with issues at a time where the envelope isn't complete and things are still open, so it's not as costly to go back and address and do air sealing. So we did mid-construction blower door testing. There was no ducts in this project, so we didn't do duct testing, but that's another aspect that we would do and we would recommend, as well as ERV duct testing. And the reason why the ERV duct testing is important is because there are performance thresholds in a different vein, but still performance thresholds for your ventilation. And if you don't pay attention to that ductwork, you're going to have leakage and it will not get to its intended target, which will interfere with your certification. And so once mid-construction is done and all of the inspections are finalized, we come in again for the broad spectrum of performance testing that is required for PHIUS projects. And that includes envelopes of the blower door testing, duct testing, ERV testing, ERV wattage testing, domestic hot water, static pressure, IR, those are the thermal images that you're seeing, IR scans. So really it's all elements of performance and design to ensure that the building and that the units are performing as is intended. And for the Granite City project, this was, it had some great points. It had some learning lessons, and I think when you have a smaller project, which this was, Usually communication with the builder is more fluid, and this builder did a great job with communicating with us. They kept us in the loop. The details on the plans, you've got a new construction plan set. You don't have any questions about the existing state of things, so that makes our process a little bit easier. And then also kudos to the design team for the domestic hot water efficiency. They had a real simple, straightforward, efficient design, which made that aspect of verification run much more smoothly. So where we came into some questions and had to work through things, one item was the blower door target, and that's similar to what Kelly was mentioning. This was a first-time builder, and we had a slightly more aggressive blower door target, which was difficult for this first-time builder. We also had a makeup air unit for the dryer, and that was one of the things that, similar to the ERV ductwork, that you need to make sure that that's not leaky. That ductwork was slightly leaky, as well as the damper on the exterior didn't do a great job. So our blower door testing was failing because of that. So in the end, we had, we needed to have a couple more trips in order to make the final pass on everything. We had to do guarded testing, which meant that we did a blower door test on both units at the same time because they were separate individual units. We noticed that that there were issues with some of the products that were being used. So the windows had leakage. It had nothing to do with the air sealing or the flashing or anything that was done, but the products themselves had some malfunctioning, as did the zip tape. And then from a verification perspective, when we brought in other folks to help with the tab verification, there was a little bit of confusion, and people just aren't used to some of the targets that we need to hit. So, but in the end, we were able to get everything done, and we got certified, and it was a big accomplishment for the whole team.
All right, so thank you, Lindsey and Kelly. So just some overall lessons learned from all of us for this project. First and foremost, that it's possible to achieve net zero without a high dollar per square foot. I know a lot of living buildings and passive house projects are custom built, highly detailed projects that kind of break the bank in some cases, but this project was not that. The other thing is that we were really able to see how exterior insulation gives us our best bang for our buck, both in early modeling and once we were doing the performance testing. And then the biggest thing for this project was that we learned that energy modeling doesn't end with design. And that's really was a first for us at Farr Associates, because we would always typically do energy modeling through design and feel like we were in a really good spot, and then, kind of cross our fingers that everything was going to perform the way that we designed it once it got into construction. And, we'd have some verification once the building was built, but there really wasn't that intermediate step of continuing to test during construction as adjustments were being made. So that was a big step forward for us in our design process that we learned from Granite City. All right, so then moving on to the Ames residence. So although it took some time for Granite City to be officially certified, we were feeling pretty confident coming into what was our next proposed PHIUS project. And while the Granite City client came to us with a desire to do PHIUS and net zero for Ames, it was something that we as the designers brought to the client. It wasn't really on their radar when this project started. So talking about scaling up, so again, Granite City was about 1,500 square feet. The Ames residence is 3,600 square feet. It is 4 bedrooms, and most critically, it was an existing structure in a dense urban neighborhood, and we needed to deal with that existing structure in context in a way that we didn't have to do in Granite City. So one thing that was unique with this project compared to Granite City was that we had a real client who had real demands for their building that included, wants and needs and comforts that, would not necessarily be what you would want necessarily if you were doing the platonic ideal of a passive house. So some of those examples were they wanted a lot of glass on the south side, and that meant that we needed to add a bunch of shading. Similarly, they had some energy intensive requests for program space, including a fully indoor sauna, radiated heated floors. They had a wine cellar that they wanted included. And so those are all things that, a typical passive house project wouldn't have to deal with. But again, this is their project. They are going to live here for hopefully 50 years plus. And so we just needed to accommodate that in both the kind of architectural design of the building and taking account for the energy performance in our WUFI modeling. So I will pass it back to Kelly to talk a little bit about what the PHIUS adjustments on this project were.
Sure, thanks, Matt. So our firm is definitely a champion of retrofitting existing building stock to transition it to being more higher performance, potentially net zero. We believe it's one of the best ways to reduce carbon in buildings by utilizing good bones that already are there in a transition for the future. But inheriting those existing conditions for a PHIUS retrofit can be challenging. In the case of this project, if anyone is familiar with how Chicago lots and how Chicago zoning works, they're very strict about setbacks and things like that. So in order to add exterior insulation to the existing walls, that beefed up the building and then was encroaching in the setbacks. And so it required 4 variances for all sides of the building, which made us have to go to the Zoning Board of Appeals, which is never a fun process. Luckily, we were granted those, but that was a delay in the project. And one of those, you're crossing your fingers the whole time that we're even going to be allowed to do it. If we hadn't been granted that, we would have had to totally relook at what the envelope could be, and maybe we wouldn't have been able to get there. So it was a good win, but it's a cautionary tale of the idea of PHIUS renovation in Chicago is kind of the way you want to do it is already sort of illegal at the start of the project and is going to require some extra legwork. On top of that, because you're inheriting an existing building, you get some surprises that you might have thought you understood how it was put together, but until you start poking holes in it, it reveals some interesting unanticipated conditions, such as some strange sister stud walls, foundation walls that weren't quite the assumed composition of their assembly, and actually where the location of where the structure was in the overall wall section. And so we actually had to tweak the details after pre-certification because we were discovering these things on site. And so a lot of those adjustments kind of had to happen on the fly. And I think that's just generally the nature of dealing with an existing building when you're trying to retrofit it. Also, we had to add height to the building so that the PV that was going to go on the roof wouldn't be shaded by adjacent properties. So again, inheriting a certain height didn't get us to where we needed to be, so we kind of had to build extra, which is added cost. So anyway, the required tweaking of all these details in quick coordination with the WUFI model, as well as kind of in real time with the contractor, had impacts to costs and timeline. So that was kind of a challenge that we had to always be negotiating that with the client. So I think Matt pointed out some of the things that the client asked for that were sort of atypical passive house features, and that's the difference, I think, from transitioning from an affordable housing model to a single family custom home model, that you still do have to serve your client, but they might have things that they want that don't really fit with the overall aspects of PHIUS. And so But more importantly, when you're dealing with just a single client, they could ask you to do things throughout the design process. So the timing of design changes are so critical in passive house design. If a client pivots randomly, it can mean a drastic waterfall of required changes to the model, detailing and assemblies, which can trigger conflict with the contractor and possibly increase costs. So anyway, all things that can be tackled, but it's definitely a totally different challenge dealing with an existing building. You're kind of discovering things as you go.
So yes, and to piggyback on what Kelly is saying, those changes not only have to go through her team and her model, but also, depending on the scope of it, need to go through our models as well. So there really is an integrated process, and it's a combination effort in order to get the home certified. For this particular project, we did have some of from the Raider side, we did have some of the same experiences in that it was an existing building, so things don't always line up nicely on plans like new construction. But we all work together, and Farr does a great job at integrating the communication and full team involvement. And we were brought in early on, including with the full team, including the builder, HVAC contractor, drywaller at our kickoff meeting, so that we made sure that everybody was aware of some of the unique criteria and requirements of not only PHIUS, but the other certifications, Energy Star and Zero Energy Ready, to make sure that we talked through all requirements. Throughout the project, there was pretty consistent communication. We were in frequent talks with the builder as well. And from some of those early dialogue chats, we were able to, or they were able to make the decision of having some aero sealing done on their ductwork, which helped them. They knew and they planned ahead that that was going to be their strategy to comply with the ductwork in the house, which proved to be very effective. So the things to consider with the project, it is an existing building. We were working with a trained builder who is used to doing high performance, but not all contractors are used to the thresholds that we need to hit. And PHIUS is a new beast, so it takes previous experience and takes that up a level. So we also on this one had a slightly more aggressive blower door target. So there was the already, preset challenge of meeting the PHIUS threshold, and then we went above. And because of a number of factors, they ended up doing aero barrier, which is a process of sealing from the inside out, and it got all of the additional holes and creaks and crevices, and was really helped them achieve their PHIUS target. So for some of the last items, as we're moving forward towards certification, it was the blower door test and using aero barrier as a technique during the tab verification, so testing and balancing and heating and cooling verification, which is required. We found that some of the ductwork was different than what was on plans, and then similar to Granite City, we found that that there were some product issues that we're actually working through with the mechanic or with the manufacturer. So all things that take a group effort, but we're moving forward towards certification, and that should happen shortly.
Great, thank you. So the lessons learned from Ames were pretty different from the lessons learned from Granite City. I think most importantly, we learned that PHIUS and net zero design doesn't happen in a vacuum. So while Granite City was more or less a blank slate, even though we had the program set, Ames represented a completely different set of challenges in that it had an existing building, a dense context, and a demanding client, which were all kind of working against that PHIUS platonic ideal of a passive house project. And so we learned through the course of design and construction that those things needed to be addressed and in some cases overcome. And in some cases, it provided us with unique opportunities for design innovation. So again, being able to be flexible and kind of think collaboratively on the fly for this project was a must and is something that kind of helps us as we're approaching new passive house projects. All right, so last project. And so we were really interested in scaling up passive house. So again, we went from 1,500 square feet to 3,600 square feet. And this project is a multi-family building, 38 units, 39,400 square feet. And it is in downtown Gary, Indiana. What's interesting about this project is that it is part of the Moving Forward program in Indiana, which helps to incentivize net zero energy affordable housing projects by setting aside a portion of the state's annual tax credit allocation through their QAP process. The goal of the program is really to prove that high efficiency affordable housing is viable in Indiana, while also building local capacity and expertise for sustainable construction. And we thought that bringing PHIUS certification to the table would be a valuable quality control step in addition to the net zero energy performance to ensure that the project performed to its stated goals. And so you can see the project site there. You can see the industrial sites to the north of it. So this is definitely an interesting site for an affordable housing project. So again, talking about getting the building net zero ready, we had kind of the basic footprint of the building set. We had done our unit plans and had it studied. And so then we really used our modeling software to dial in what the assemblies would be for our envelope. And one of the things that came about as part of that, again, this is an affordable housing project, so we don't have unlimited funds. So we really needed to find the right assemblies that both would reach our performance goals, but would not have diminishing returns or cost a lot of money. And so we really took advantage of our WFI model to test the different options and kind of dial in on what the optimal performance level wanted to be for our assemblies that could also minimize costs. And one of the interesting things that we ended up finding during our design here was that even though Gary is in a northern climate, just by sake of the orientation and scale of the building, we were having the most issues meeting the cooling load. And so actually we ended up reducing the amount of insulation from where we had started, and we also increased the solar heat gain coefficient on our windows to help kind of counteract some of those cooling load issues. So that was something that, on the back of the napkin, if you do what the typical PHIUS assemblies are, we found out once we got into the meat of it that we could dial that in a little closer and actually save money at the same time. So then we also, after we designed the envelope to PHIUS standards, we studied multiple roof scenarios to figure out what was the most efficient and cost-effective way to provide the PV panels that we needed to make the project net zero. And so the interesting thing is we work closely with the owner and the contractor to test these different scenarios. And we were somewhat hamstrung because the building site is oriented north to south, which is not optimal for PV design. And so what we ended up with, interesting enough, was the gable roof on the lower right. And that was because the other options either were much more expensive for PV canopies or other building mounted methods, and because with a gabled roof, you can apply the PV flush mount to the roof without having to do any additional tilting or structure. And also the PV would never be self-shading, where in some of the more flat roof options or canopy options, you are always kind of working against yourself for PV to be shading its neighbors in a north-south orientation. One of the other interesting things about this project is that it is a first for PV in Gary. So we worked extensively with the local municipality and the utility to figure out what it meant, both from a kind of fire and safety standpoint and from how net metering would work, because this was something that the local municipality had never done. And so again, per the goals of the project, kind of building that local capacity to do this in the future.
So this was our first time working on a true multifamily mixed use type passive house project. We registered the project under the 2018 Plus certification, which uses the newer multifamily calculators for several items, including the overall calculator that determines your target values regarding heating and cooling loads. The calculator used to just take into account the location of the project, but now adjusts the targets based on your interior condition floor area, which works in your favor with multifamily because it takes into account also the amount of occupants in the building as well. And so it makes your targets a little more feasible to hit. Scaling up on this project required more intentional selections of equipment and fixtures throughout all the units, namely the laundry appliances and water heaters. The overall quantity impacted the loads that needed to be taken into consideration, as well as the balancing for ventilation became much more complex. Also, when you scale up to multifamily, there's just a lot of other things that PHIUS makes you calculate and prove out with several different calculators, including the miscellaneous electrical loads. You learn that they make up a much larger percentage of the energy use than it would in a single family home. So things you learn just by having to go through the exercise of the certification. We also had to examine what portion of the building was going to be PHIUS certifiable. And we had to adjust our WFI model appropriately. In our case, we removed the retail tenant space, kind of shown here in the red dashed box, from the model, which meant that it would need to have its own dedicated mechanical system so that we could kind of break it off and not worry about certifying that. And that has a lot to do with you don't know the tenant that's going to necessarily be going in there, so you don't have as much control over what exactly is going to happen there. So a lot of times those things are split out in multifamily projects when you're going for PHIUS certification. In addition, we determined that the kind of residential support spaces such as the lobby, laundry room, kind of community room, were also going to fall outside the boundary, considering that they had their own dedicated systems with the exception of fresh air. So we're still in the process of PHIUS pre-certification, hoping that these delineations are acceptable, but I think it's important to know that what your boundary is for what you're going to get certified does have to be you have to find kind of strict boundaries between what the systems are and that the cutoffs are easy to prove out for PHIUS to review. I would say even with all of the energy saving improvements over code with the better envelope, better windows, the roof area, even though, as Matt said, was more optimized for solar collection based on the gable versus flat, was still not enough space to cover the amount of PV needed to hit net zero, which meant that a large array needed to move to the ground near the parking area. So it is a question about scaling up if you're trying to get to net zero, what the sweet spot is for your energy use that you can actually meet. You can actually cover that with PV with your building area, and so that can be a challenge because sometimes you don't have site area to make up the difference. So in our case, we did. So this project will be on target to be net zero.
Okay, so thanks, Kelly. So we are just in the beginning stages as well as the project has started. We've gone through a number of conversations and considerations, and also working with PHIUS in order to stay in compliance with what their criteria is for the verifier. So some of those items are the tab verification and the type of whole building systems that they're using, whole building ventilation systems that is self-adjusting. And so those two right now are some of the bigger details that we're working through, as well as we had already worked through the ventilation in order to get it from just supplied to the unit to be supplied to all of the bedrooms, which is a requirement for PHIUS. So the design portion is super huge. And then as we move forward, this is a bigger project, bigger footprint. Consistency is going to be key. We're going to be using sampling on this project. So we'll be looking at and testing a variety of units, but not all of the units. So we need to make sure that air sealing, installation, and all of the performance metrics, we're going to stay, they need to be consistent, and we need to have that constant communication with the project team. So stay tuned.
All right, so then one final plug here. As part of our office's ethos of transparency, we like to share our best practices wherever we can, including this presentation. But part of that philosophy, Broadway Lofts is part of the Living Building Challenge Affordable Housing Pilot Program. And as a participant, we share our stories with other affordable housing projects throughout the country on a monthly basis. In an effort to reduce the learning curve that's associated with some of the more challenging aspects of high performance affordable housing. We also contribute research and best practices to the Framework for Affordable Housing document, which is what you see here, which you can find for free online at ILFI's website, which collects all of these stories and provides a bunch of valuable resources for developers and designers who are hoping to do something similar. So if you are in that boat, definitely check that out. All right, so then just to wrap up here, some big picture lessons learned from each of these projects. Again, from Granite City, we learned that PHIUS and net zero performance is achieved in design, during construction, and in occupancy. So as an architect, your job is not done once the drawings are finished. At Ames, we learned that there is no one-size-fits-all option when it comes to PHIUS and net zero design, that we need to take into account all of the specific performance goals and constraints of a project, and especially client needs and wants, in addition to our own performance goals. And then lastly, scaling up to multifamily in PHIUS and net zero presents both challenges and opportunities. In some cases, it has more complexity. There's more complexity in terms of modeling and scheduling occupancies and figuring out what's in and what's out of the PHIUS envelope, but it also has its advantages based on the consolidation of the envelope and the consolidation of building systems and kind of more overall KBTs to play with per occupant. So there are challenges and advantages to scaling up to multifamily. And overall, our goal is to continue to scale up PHIUS for broad applications, both in Chicago and nationwide, because really the impact of all of this is overall carbon reduction. Hopefully there's alleviation of some stress that's related to your energy bills for single family residences or affordable housing, and then really getting buy-in from all of the different housing types to prove that this is a viable, reasonable, and really the way you should be building housing in the future. And so with that, we thank you for your attention. I think we went over a little bit, but we're pretty good. And then any questions for anybody? And thank you.
Awesome. So as the moderator, I get the ability to ask my personal question first. So sorry, everyone else, but this is to the whole panel. Given what you've experienced on the different scales of these 3 projects, you have your choice on your next project. Are you going for a single family home? Are you going for a renovation project? Are you going for a duplex, or are you doing a larger scale multifamily? And Matt, we'll start with you.
You know, as somebody who has been a big proponent of multifamily affordable housing, I think that that would be my personal choice. That's why I'm personally very excited about the Broadway Lost project as kind of that proof of concept type of project for the Chicago region. There have been certified passive houses in our area, but they're kind of confined to smaller footprints and less units, whereas Broadway Lost will really be a game changer in terms of scale. And we've seen elsewhere, you know, in Pennsylvania, for example, from the opening remarks today, that passive house can be, you know, written into the QAPs for affordable housing, and it's a way to be successful. And so we're really excited to kind of push that forward in the places that we work, especially in Illinois. And hopefully make that kind of the baseline from which the rest of affordable housing happens in the future.
Awesome. Lindsey, you want to go next?
Sure. Sorry, for some reason the sunlight's coming in, I'm getting blinded. So I think I agree with Matt in regards to multifamily. As a team, typically new construction is, I'm not going to say easier, but when you go into an existing building, you never know what you're going to find. However, when we talk about, like when we really talk about green buildings and embodied carbon and stuff, the greenest building, you know, is typically the one that's already been built. So if we can save our buildings and reconvert them, even though it's a struggle for the project team, that's what I would like to see more. And especially with multifamily buildings or commercial buildings or anything, you're able to kind of spread out the savings with the loads because there's more occupants. So there's, I think that, you know, there's different ways that you can get creative about it, even though it's also going to present some more difficulties and opportunities to work through stuff, you know, so.
Yeah. Kelly, what's your
I think it's already been kind of answered, but the question is a little bit loaded in that you're asking me what I would pick, and if it's based on quantities of headaches, I would go with new construction, you know, green site, but that's not really the mantra and the kind of spirit of what we at Farr Associates, as well as I think a lot of the people that are attending this conference, really care about. So I think to Lindsey's point, there's a lot of amazing building stock out there that is waiting for new life. And as we kind of reimagine buildings that we already have, rather than knock them down, we should be really looking at retrofit. I mean, it's the most energy efficient, low carbon thing you can do. And so that's really the thing we should all be striving for the most, whether that is duplex, single family, or multifamily. We should be thinking about it all the time with existing buildings. And so probably the most difficult, but at the same time, the most important.
Yeah, thanks. I agree as well with that answer, Kelly. I think this one's for Matt. A question from the audience from Drew. From your experience, what has been the biggest challenge with living building challenge in affordable housing? What can be done there to maybe help that process become more easier?
I muted myself, sorry. Yeah, it really is a challenge, and I would say look at those resources that are available through ILFI. I think if you are looking at the chat on the right, Susan Purry, who's one of my cohort folks at ILFI, put the website that accesses all of those resources. I think we're finding that just the timeline of affordable housing is kind of tough. All of the projects that are part of our cohort, they are 5-year plus projects, and each one of them goes through multiple iterations, either dealing with local municipalities, funding, working with contractors who may not have familiarity with the process. So some of the things that come up all the time are funding, first cost of materials, first costs of PV, how you can get net metering to utilities that don't have it. And so in addition to providing some of the kind of stories and best practices of the projects that are part of the cohort, they also provide advocacy for some of the things where we have identified gaps. So, if there is a state that doesn't incentivize, passive house or net zero or LBC in their QAP, then the folks at ILFI are kind of helping out to identify ways to get that in there. So again, kind of in addition to providing the baseline resources, they're also identifying places where we can do better, and they have some of those connections and resources to push that forward.
Great. That's a great answer. Lindsey, for you, working on a handful of different scales, do you find that the quality from the builder ranges significantly, from smaller single family up to maybe something like Broadway Lofts that's multifamily, a couple levels?
I think it's builder dependent, and how we've had really successful single family homes and really unsuccessful single family homes, and the same thing with multifamily and everywhere in between. And it really does depend on, I feel like us as rater verifiers, we're here to support and give the resources and reminders and things like that, but you really have to have a buy-in from everyone on the team, especially for the blower door testing, because the air barrier, Matt and Kelly can have everything down to a science on their plans, and if that's not followed, or if there's any questions and the builder doesn't ask about it, then and there's something that a fix is done, that can really cause issues. So one of the key things for success that has come out and has kind of been a funny little component of Passive House is having a dedicated ASS air sealing specialist on the team. And so they're the ones that are making sure that the air barrier details and all of the air sealing details are being carried out in the process, and they're there every day or however many times, to make sure that that's done. Because if there's no one, and that's not the role. I mean, it could be if that's how your project is running, but the role of the verifier is to kind of help and to see this in periodic states, but you need someone who's really on charge of it, or on top of it and in charge of it. So I think it just depends, and hopefully, we really do need to support our trades, because the trades are the ones that are doing it. Like, we come in there and everybody plays their roles, but we have to support every trade member, from the drywaller, insulation, all of these glorious jobs at times. But if they don't do it, we're not going to pass. So it takes everyone.
Liz, are we out of time here? Or do we have time for one more? Nope,
I think we
we're
need
done
to wrap it up here. If you guys have any final thoughts, but thank you guys all again. Scott, Kelly, Matthew, and Lindsey, you did a wonderful job. And thank you again to our sponsors. So make sure you take some time between sessions to visit our sponsors in our virtual expo hall. And up next, we've got our final thing for the day. We have our virtual workshops where you can take a deeper dive into 2 different sessions. So you can either choose from Passive House 101 or Below Slab Vapor Barriers, Nuisance or Necessity. So hope to see you there, and thank you again, everyone.